today, but do hope to be here as we go along. Deborah and Lou Savage are taking a trip to Europe, so we won't see them for a couple of weeks, but we'll see them after they get back. And Les Atkinson sent me an email and also a message that Sue had the doctor's appointment today. You know, she's recovering from a broken hip. And so he'll be back later. He had a little story he wanted me to share with you all later, as you might imagine. All right. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 1. And let me just start by asking, did you have any questions about the text or the video itself that you want us to discuss before we're all done here? And as you're thinking about it, I'm going to grab my pen. Okay, any questions? Jerry?
Since we're going to be on this for a month, I'd like to go back to the origins of what's written there in Genesis. Other religions in that sort of, what time period do we think it's come from? There was a hotbed for religion. Every religion had some kind of idea of creation. Is it just logical that thinking 2,500 or 3,000 years ago, you'd come up with 7 days, or first it was water, then earth, then sun, you know,
Right.
These pieces, and what is this different from what other religions at the time were trying to understand?
Right. That's a great question. And, you know, I don't pretend in any way to be kind of an expert on other religions, but I do think our best guess would be that the first creation story was probably written around the end of the exile. I think I mentioned that in the video. And so just think about this. The people of Israel for 70 years or so had been in exile in Babylon, which had its own creation story. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation story. And creation begins with an act of violence, the creation of the earth, where one god rips another god in half. And then you have the sky and the, you know, so it's kind of a violence-filled creation story. Why would you have that? Well, I think the Romans had something very similar with the story of Romulus and Remus and so forth. If your way of life is built on military might, then if you have a creation story where the world's created in an act of violence, then basically you're sanctifying the survival of the fittest. Nature, red in tooth and claw. It's not just a thing, and it's not something to be civilized out of us and cultured out of us, but it's kind of written into the fabric of the universe. So if your creation story is that the world was created through an act of violence, then it really legitimizes violence. In that respect, some people feel like the Hebrews were writing a counter story. That the world is not created in violence, and therefore predetermined to ever be caught in a cycle of violence. But rather, God brought the world into being and called it good. Just think about the different starting point that is. And in that first chapter, there's not the slightest scintilla of violence. It even appears that the humans, and certainly the animals, are given vegetation to eat. There's no nature red in tooth and claw going on in this first chapter. So in some respects, while I don't pretend to know the Babylonian creation stories very well, if you're curious about it and you're ever on your search engine, just put in Babylonian creation story and see that's probably the theological context out of which a lot of this writing is done. If the first chapter of Genesis was written toward the end or at the end of the exile, then virtually everybody who's doing the writing, whether it's an individual or a compendium of people, are all born during the exile, either as part of the remnant in Jerusalem, more likely as part of the captive in Babylon. So they're being released at the end of the exile, and now it's like they're reinscribing what kind of people they're going to be. This is a fresh start. And one way you do that is, who are we? Where did we come from? Well, this is the world in which we live. What and you can end the first chapter singing "What a Wonderful World," right? Everything's good. Good, 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 good. Every time God creates, it's good. It'll be different in the next chapter. So this is a very positive look at creation, and possibly written over and against a very violent killed creation story. Now, in terms of other religions at that time, I don't really know, but I think, like, certainly there was a thriving Chinese civilization happening, but largely unknown to these folks who had been in exile for 70 years. So that's a great question. And that's why the question of when it was written actually is really important. If Moses wrote it, then, we're talking 900 years before the Common Era. But if it's written at the time of the exile, no matter how many times the story has been passed down and transformed over the years orally, if it's written at the time of the exile, we're talking 538, 532 before the Common Era, and that's a significantly different time. There's a lot more that's happened in terms of literary activity and so forth. Then, anyway, so that's all I got. But I do think that's what's driving a lot of these questions about where the stories originated. If we understand the context in which they were written. Another thing that's kind of an interesting feature, right, is when God creates the great lights, the sun and the moon, and then there's kind of a dependent clause, and the stars, right? And the stars. It's just a dependent clause right there. God created the sun and moon and the stars. In Babylon, the stars determined your fate. The stars created you. The stars were, there was destiny written into the stars. And here you have, God created the stars. It really kind of takes that whole kind of Babylonian theology and puts it and makes the stars part of creation, subject to the ordering of the Creator. And that's a big deal. So again, I think in some respects it's protest literature as much as anything else. It's like, no, this is how we should tell the story. And in telling the story this way, this is how we should live. Kind of interesting. Any other questions you want to bat around a little bit, either about the text or the video, before we start in on what I have planned for you? Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the chat over here for the Zoom as well. And I'll let you know if something pops up in there. So let's talk about, first of all, why it is that the first creation story goes from Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1, all the way through chapter 2, verse 4a. Okay, if you have a Bible, I want you to open it up. We've got several back there, if anybody wants to grab one. What we wanted to do is to go from Genesis 1 all the way through verse 31, and then the first story is done. So after the text was written, well after the text was written, okay, original Hebrew is just made up of more or less consonants. Okay, original Hebrew is more or less just made up of consonants. And then if you look at a Hebrew word, I'll demonstrate this for you sometime. There are these little markings above and below the word. They're called pointing. That pretty much serves as the vowels for how to pronounce it. Okay. And so original Hebrew text will be nothing but consonants, very small space in between the words, because you're writing on papyrus and it's hard to come by and you don't have a leisure of big spaces. The pointing was added later for the sake of reading it out loud. Punctuation would be added later. The divisions of chapters and verses would be added later. And whoever, bless their heart, whoever decided to end this first story where they did, I just think missed badly. It's like a dart that hits the window instead of the dartboard on the wall, right? I mean, it's that bad of a miss. So if you look at chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created." And then it continues. You probably have, your Bible probably stuck a subheading in there, but this is a continuation of that verse. "In the day that the Lord God made the heavens and the earth." Da, 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 da. So here's one judgment call being made. One judgment call is that the first half of verse 4 is an introduction to the story that continues in the second half of verse 4 and throughout the chapter. Most people feel like that's a mistake, that the first part of verse 4 is actually the summation of what we just saw. Okay, so you read that first story and said, "These are the generations of the heaven and earth as they were created." And now you have a new story that begins. Okay, whoever added verses didn't see it that way. Whoever added chapter didn't see it that way. They made the first chapter all about the first 6 days of creation. And then the 7th day of creation, they put into the second chapter. So I'll just tell you that if modern biblical scholars were adding chapter and verse now, the end of chapter 1 would be after chapter 2, verse 4a. You understand? Because it's pretty well considered that that's all one cohesive part. And then the next story begins in verse 4b, the second half of verse 4. And that's really where that chapter separation should be. That's how most of us read it. And if you look up any biblical study on the creation story, it will take you up through chapter 2, verse 4a. It will not end at the end of chapter 1. Because one way of reading this story is the whole purpose of the 6 days of creation is to get us to Sabbath. Sabbath is what it's all about. And if you just confine yourself to the first chapter, you missed the Sabbath. You missed the 7th day when God rested and made it holy. So I know it sounds confusing, and I'm sorry. I wish we could all go back in time and tell whoever originally put in the chapters and verses to move the dot over a little farther and to make the whole creation story, that first creation story, one single chapter. But they didn't do that, and I don't know why. And it happened before we were born, so none of us is to blame. But one question it raises is, do we have 2 creation stories or just one in these first 2 chapters of Genesis? And when I was in college, I went to a Pentecostal Holiness Bible College and officially took a fairly fundamentalist view of Scripture, that everything was verbal. The official view of the Pentecostal Holiness Church is that the Scriptures are verbal plenary inspiration of God, meaning God told the writer everything to write, every part of it, both the meaning and the words. And if that's the denomination's official position, it's not the Presbyterian. But if that's the denomination's official position, it's kind of hard to teach Old Testament classes in college and deal with something that's as obvious as two different creation stories in chapters 1 and 2. So the way I heard it explained was actually chapter 1 is the creation story. Chapter 2 is a commentary on the creation story. Okay, and that was told us to mollify our questions about the two stories. Now, I'm going to challenge you to do this for next week. Okay? Circle back to the first creation story in chapter 1.
I think Jeremy does.
Think about the order of creation.
It's in the box, we can just tell Jeremy.
Then go to the second story in chapter 2 and see if the order is the same.
I know, it wasn't even, it was that concert.
Oh, yeah.
And then the question for you will be, if the order is the same, yes, you can see chapter 2 is just kind of an elucidation, a commentary, a little more detail on what was given in chapter 1. But if the order is different, then my question is, how can that be a commentary? It felt like a different story. So I want you to look for that for yourself, so that you can experience the growing pains I experienced when I was in college and started looking at these questions and thinking, oh my gosh, this is powerful. Okay, so that's your assignment for next week. It's not just to read the second chapter, but also to kind of look at the differences in the order of what things are created. Okay. All right. So, and the whole purpose of that is to answer the question for us whether there are two stories or one. I am approaching it as two different stories, and you don't have to see it that way, but I want you to see why I'm approaching it. Okay.
I'm able to donate.
I'm trying to save some things for next week because I don't want to look ahead too much, and next week we can look back at what we've already covered. So I'll try to stay focused on the rest of this first chapter today, on this first chapter for the rest of the day. I mentioned some salient features on how this story is told.
Yeah.
Number one, you have the phrase "God said," and it was, right? God said, "Let there be light," and it was. God said, let the dome be separated from the waters below, and it was. God said, let the seas be separated from the land, and it was. So that's a real interesting feature, and this is a speaking God who says something and it comes into being. I mentioned in the video that the way that God's saying in reality connect is something we're going to see throughout the scripture. God says it, it's true. God doesn't lie, and neither should we. That's why lying is prohibited, right? Don't bear false witness, because when you bear false witness, the witness you're giving is not commensurate with reality. And society cannot function if God habitually lies. We are done for. You can't trust. There's no faith, right?
Okay.
Instead, what we hear is the steadfast love of God endures forever. Right? God is steadfast and true. Because we just cannot. If God were unreliable, then what good?
It's a
Right? So in some ways, don't miss that. That's a theological statement. God said it is. God said it is.
Button or,
Which
that's
is great,
Mark just had.
because the next thing is God saw it,
I thought we had a church, but
that it was
we'll let
good.
it get to 60.
So now God is declaring things good.
Oh, yeah.
If God says it's good, then it's good. Babylonian.
Yeah, that's, yeah, so, okay. And we
If
don't-
God says
A new button.
the earth is good, then it's good. It's got inherent value. And its goodness is not related to what we can make of it or how it serves us. It's not related to its utilitarian value to us. Its goodness is because God said it's good. It's been proclaimed good. I think that's a huge big deal. And those are two things happening in this story. Is God says what God says and what is one, and God keeps declaring the earth good. So don't miss that there's a theological program going on in the telling of this story. Any questions about that so far?
Mark, did you say you thought the timeline was 532 BCE?
Yeah, let me see.
That's
I mentioned it in the video. I'm just terrible with dates, y'all. So
what
let
did
me,
they use for a creation story before that?
I'm sorry, were there creation stories before that?
Yeah.
Yes, a lot. The Babylonian creation story
Was regarded,
is a lot earlier. Yeah, for sure.
but there was no Jewish
Well,
creation story before that.
well, sure. It existed in oral form. There's not a written account before that. Yeah. So just remember that societies go through a certain evolution themselves, right? When they're hunter-gatherers, you don't have written language. It's all oral. And then when you start domesticating crops and animals, where you don't have to be hunter-gatherers, you can actually settle and have settlements. Then you start to develop the need for writing. So how do you verify that this land belongs to you? If you have a document that says so, then that helps. So the evolution of society is that once we went from being hunter-gatherers to being more domesticated and settled, then we had the need for some kind of enduring account. Then you also develop leisure, because if you have domesticated crops and you bring in enough harvest to last you for a while, and you can't do anything in the field right now, you go out, you feed the animals, then you have time on your hands, and leisure is what leads to the art, right? You have the ability to express yourself in other ways. When you're scraping out survival, you've put that to the side. But now you have, and this gives rise to culture and art and a sense of beauty and meaning and reflection and philosophy and religion. These things, you have time to chew on them together, and you've got your harvest time. Now we're going to have a religious holiday to celebrate the harvest time. All of the civilizations did that, not just the people of Israel. And it was part of that whole development of human community. So these stories would have been oral for a long time. And then at a certain point, they're written. Why written? Why do stories have to be written? Why can't they just be oral and stay oral? We would look back, and we don't trust oral stories because we know how they change over time. And we want the story to be right, darn it. Not sure if that's the impulse behind writing these stories rather than continuing to simply hand them down orally. It just, maybe they felt like they needed an account so it wouldn't be forgotten. And the possibility of writing it was now there. I mean, other civilizations had libraries and so forth, but that's a significant thing when the oral tradition becomes the written tradition. It changes the nature of the way that you believe. It takes away some of this dynamism, right? Because if it's oral, it's going to change over time. It's going to easily adapt. When you tell a story of something that happened, especially if it's a mythological story, right? A story about how God works in the world, it's going to change over time because you see the world differently. But if it's written, it's going to keep the worldview of the people that wrote it. So, you and I read a Bible of folks who were not stupid. We don't want to say that. That would be a big mistake. But who more or less thought the sun rotated around the earth, thought the earth was relatively flat, thought, that the earth was stationary, saw the world as a three-level universe with the heavens above and the earth in the middle and the underworld below, literally that way, in some way, or at least meaningfully that way. When we read stories written by people with that view of the world, now we have an extra layer of work to do because we don't see the world that way. We know the earth is relatively global, round, and we know that it moves around the sun, and we know there's no four corners of the earth, and all of those things that our biblical writers might have taken for granted, we simply know are not the way the world is. So how do we hear truth in a text that continues to carry its original meaning in a world where some of those meanings are no longer valid? That's the challenge of reading the Bible as a modern person, and we should lean into that challenge, and accept that worldviews change over time, but there can still be truth in the story. We're dealing with that with these stories. I feel like I'm just rambling, so please raise your hand and tell me stop if you want. Okay. Let's look at each day real quickly, and then we'll talk about just what it kind of means in the bigger arc of things. I posited that there's a day zero, right? I didn't make that up. It came from Bill Brown, who continues to be my best mentor when it comes to reading the Hebrew Bible. If you didn't have a chance to see the video, I really feel like the King James Bible royally messed up with the first verse of the Bible. You learned it, I learned it, we all learned it from the King James Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, period, right? If that's the first verse, and if that's well translated, what it means is that God is creating everything out of nothing, more or less, right? I think it was Schelling posted the question, why is there something and not nothing? As the original question of philosophy. And this verse would seem to be answering that. In the beginning, there was God. God is eternal, and God created the heavens and the earth. It's often called creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, right? I heard a minister preach a whole sermon on that. He kept using the phrase creatio ex nihilo. And I had a youth group there because we were on a mission trip. And they had, even though he had stipulated at the very beginning what it means, they weren't paying attention at the beginning. And they were just bewildered.
what was that stuff he kept saying? Cracto next nihil, and you know, they had no idea. But think of the millions of sermons that have been preached on creation out of nothing. Think of all the theology that's been spun out of that. And a lot of it goes back to the way the King James Bible translated that first sentence, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. For that to be a valid translation, the word created needs to be a verb, a main verb, with God as a subject. But in Hebrew, it's not a main verb. It introduces a dependent clause. And so our Bible, in order to translate it better, reads this way. In the beginning. So the first word in Hebrew, in the Hebrew text for this book is Genesis. That's where it gets its name. And that means beginning. And in the form, it's a preposition. In the beginning. All right. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, comma, we're still waiting on the main verb here. We're still waiting on the main clause. Here it is. The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind of God swept over the face of the waters. That's the whole sentence. So what does it mean? It's not creation out of nothing. There was something, there was a vacuum, a void. These words can be translated in a number of ways, but there was a formless void there. That's what God turned into the world. Okay. So it reorients us from saying this is creation out of nothing to this is bringing order out of chaos. Formlessness becomes form. Look what happened. Out of that formless void, we separate light and dark. Out of that formless void, we get the dome and the earth. We get day and night. We get the great light, sun and moon and stars. We get vegetation. And so forth. You see? So if you translate that first sentence correctly, it encompasses verses 1 and 2, and it changes the nature of the story from creation out of nothing to creating order out of chaos. And the Common English Bible translates it this way. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was without shape or form. It was dark over the deep sea, and God's wind swept over the waters. So modern translations do not follow the King James Bible because it's a mistranslated first verse. And I don't know if that disappoints you. It disappointed me. I thought, darn it. All those great sermons on creation out of nothing based on Genesis 1:1. And it really is not a good translation. I only say that because I want you to read the story as order out of chaos. How do you get order out of chaos? You know, it's like you folks sit over there and you folks sit over there. Stop the riot. You two, this team get over here, that team get over there. And over here, find out who's in charge and give them this, you're taking chaos and making order out of it, taking formlessness and giving it form. And that's what you see happening more and more intricately throughout the story. I mentioned the mathematical intricacy. Again, this is something that Bill Brown points out. You got 7 days, 7 different declarations that God saw it and it was good. There are 8 different acts because like in day 6, God will create animals and then God will create humans. So there are 2 different acts of creation on that day. And then the number 7, this probably is a result of some of the things they learned in Babylon. You've got this great Persian science that's been going on in this region for a long time. And one thing they've figured out is the number 7 has these incredible qualities to it. And you know, stop your favorite mathematician sometime and just say, talk to me about the number 7. And they will go on and on and on about that number. And that goes way back in the early stages of mathematics and so forth. And the folks telling this story get it. The calendars are built around it. It seems inscribed into the universe. Now, could someone have established an 8-day week? I guess they could have, but they didn't, because the number 7 has this kind of dependable mathematical role and always has, and influenced those who came up with the calendar. Every calendar is a little bit wrong, right? You have to have a leap year because they're all a little bit wrong. And yet every calendar is largely right. And they focus around 7 days in a week. I would suggest that the 7-ishness of the first chapter is a reflection of early formation of math and the way that the calendaring followed that, as opposed to this being the very first story ever, right? And all the other calendars followed. I think that's putting the cart before the horse. So the first sentence in Hebrew has 7 words in it. The second sentence has 14 words. God is mentioned 35 times. The earth is mentioned 21 times. These are all, you don't know that with the English translation, right? That's not something we can gather because it has to be translated, and translation is never a one-to-one correspondence. But the fact that it was written so artistically and with such mathematical precision really kind of points that it wasn't just the content of the story, but it's the presentation that mattered. You know, my son is in culinary school in France right now, and he's always putting pictures of the latest thing cooked. And there's just not a lot of food there, but boy, it's beautiful. And the whole point is that you don't gorge yourself, you season it, you enjoy it, and it looks lovely, and that invites you into it, right? You know, in some respects, this first chapter is all about presentation, and it's done very, very deliberately. Okay, so day 0, we've got a void in a vacuum. That's the first 2 verses. In day 1, we separate the light from the darkness, and then we have day and night. Now, I will tell you that there's a slight bit of conflict here. Because you have light and darkness in the first day, day and night, but then in the 4th day, you get the sun and the moon, and the sun is a light by day, and the moon is a light by night. It's kind of hard to tell what the light and darkness are in the first day if we haven't created the sun yet. You know what I mean? So again, it's not going to be scientifically satisfying if we look at the details and try to imagine it. But you have light, darkness. A lot of science begins with classification, division. How do you know the essence of a tree? The first thing you say, well, a tree is not a fox, right? A tree is not a fox. So what's the difference? And then you start defining what makes a tree and a fox a fox. classification, division, difference, binary differences, and so forth. These are all the first hallmarks of any scientific thinking. And so what we have is indicators of early science happening here with classification. Okay. So you get light and darkness in verses 3 through 5. In verses 6 through 8, we separate the dome from the waters. Next week we'll look and see another story of creation. And one thing I would invite you to look for is what happens to the waters there? Because it seems like in the early chapters, and this will come back in the Noah story as well, chapters 6 through 11, 6 through 9. It seems like the notion was that until the rain began to fall, and perhaps the flood of Noah is the first rain, but until the rain began to fall, the way the ground was watered is through a living spring coming out of the earth. So there really are waters below. They were very attentive to aquifers. Just think of the area of the world where this was written. You know, they don't get a lot of rain, but they have oases. They need water out of the ground. They're really attentive to that. So on the second day, the separation is from the waters above and waters below. And then in the third day, you're going to get the separation of the seas from the dry land. And it seems like the idea was that until the rain began to fall, the rainbow of Noah might have been, you know, the first such instance of both, that the water was watered by internal spring. Kind of an interesting thing. Day 4, then we do get the sun, moon, and stars, as we mentioned. And day 5, I just love this language, and I want you to pay attention to it, because when we get to the Noah story, it's going to come back in kind of an interesting way for us. Let's look at verse 20. And God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures. Okay, so now we're in the water. And let birds fly above the earth, across the dome of the sky. Okay, so we got the water fowl, the aquatic life, and now the avian life, right? And so the first thing we say about the aquatic life is God created the sea monsters. And every living creature that moves of every kind with which the waters swarm. And every winged bird of every kind. You see, we're still doing science, right? We've got water creatures, they're creatures. And you got birds, they're creatures. But boy, are they different, right? These guys live in the water, and these guys live in the sky. It won't be till the next day that we get the land dwellers. So just kind of interesting, but pay attention to that language. Living creature that move of every kind with which the waters swarm, every winged bird of every kind. There'll be moments in the Noah story that we see that very same language. Next week, we'll hear a different language for describing animals. And there'll be moments in the Noah story where we hear that language. So it's just, I want you to pay attention to it. I think the speech patterns going on here. And okay, so that was the 5th day. We got the swimmers and the flyers. And on the 6th day, we've got the creepy crawlers and the four-leggeds and cattle, creeping things, wild animals of every kind. So remember, we're in a time where there's already been the domestication of cattle as well as crops. So that's another division that we've added that perhaps the forebears might not have known, which is you got domesticated animals versus wild animals. So that gives you a little sense of whoever's telling this story is not living as a hunter-gatherer, where you don't have that distinction. They're living in a settled place where now you know the difference between cattle and wild animals. Isn't that interesting? I think it's fascinating.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So you get all that on the 6th day, and then verse 26. Let's just look at humans here. God said, let us make humankind in our image. Notice the plural language there. To whom is God talking? To whom is God talking? I mentioned for you that the word used for God throughout this story is Elohim. It is originally a plural form of the word Elo. It's a common word for God. People who believe steadfastly in monotheism, one God, still use the word Elohim. So it's not so much that there are many gods, but that there's plurality in God that I think you might hear in that term. And yet God is talking to somebody, or God is talking to God's self or something. Let us, also plural, let us make human in our image. We're so short on time, I just have to think of which rabbit hole I'm gonna go down. And I'm gonna let that one go. So first of all, humans are unique in the other realm, and this is continued science of distinction here, right? The uniqueness of humans is that we are made in the image of God and whoever God is talking to. Maybe there's a divine counsel. Maybe God is just speaking out of God's plurality. Whatever, we are reflective of that. That is our uniqueness. And then we also have a certain standing in, so not only are we dividing and making divisions and classifying, we're also kind of building a bit of a hierarchy. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. That's a phrase you'll see in Noah's story often. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. So the language about God here is singular. God created humankind in his image, singular. In his image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now you have humankind in its plurality. Okay, so the human is created, and among the human we have male and female. From the God who said, "Let us create human in our image." So it could be that the plurality of gender is already found in God. That, and could be that our gender are what reflect the image of God. I would say if you're going to be a biblical literalist, so far, if you ask what is it about humans that reflects the image of God, it's the fact that we are both male and female.
Good.
It's just right there, and I don't think I'm like making that up. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves on the earth." So when I talk about hierarchies, toward the end of the lecture, there are a couple of different ways of looking at them. Some people have argued that the orders of creation start with the lowest and work their way up to the most majestic. And just happens that we're the most majestic. Oh gosh. And some people see a hierarchy that we're going from the more primitive perhaps to the more sophisticated. The least honored to the most honored. That's usually the hierarchy that's reflected in people that read chapters 1 and 2 as one story. So not only is humankind at the pinnacle, but woman? No, surely not. Surely not. Next week, the man's going to be created before the woman. Surely. Let's back up a little bit and rethink that. So there's a hierarchy. So there's one view of hierarchy here because of the language of fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion. So it's the text that introduces the hierarchy, not bad people, and not self-inflated people. But what's the hierarchy? Humans have the power, the dominion power, the power to subdue, and so forth. We'll look at those terms a little more as we go along, just to kind of see what might be implied in them. But there is a command in verse 28, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish, birds, and other living creatures. But then look what happens in verse 29 and 30. God says, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. So right now we're vegetarians. So far. And to every beast of the earth and every bird of the air and everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has a breath of life, I have given them every green plant for food. So just as soon as you get humans as the pinnacle, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion, suddenly we're brought down a notch and said, oh yeah, and your salad bar is the same salad bar as the birds and the fish and the bees, by the way. So I just, there is language of hierarchy, dominion, as it were, but there's also a lot of equivocating language too, that your good and their good are the same. And humans and animals created on the sixth day. Don't let someone just tell you humans were created on the sixth day, because we weren't the only thing being created on the sixth day. We're not the only things being created, male and female. And we're not the only things that have been told to be fruitful and multiply. That's not strictly human. It is for human, but not strictly for human. But the uniqueness is the dominion and fill the earth and subdue it. Okay, so it leaves us with a bit of a legacy. We have a lot of interpretive work to do. I have talked a lot. What do you want to say before we wrap it up here? Any other questions? Any concerns?
I don't want to get too far jumped ahead. How do we reconcile dominion and control over all of the sea and the air with the need later on to have, and I forget, is it Peter who watches the sheet grow up and come down with all the food and be told he can now eat all the various foods? Aren't we being told that at the beginning?
Well, we haven't been told that yet, because there's a big gap there in terms of the development of faith. So by the time Peter has his vision in Acts chapter 10, the Hebrews' faith has already distinguished between clean and unclean animals. That hasn't been introduced to us yet. It's coming. It'll hit us long before Acts. It will hit us in the Noah story. When you ask yourself, how many of each kind of animal was Noah supposed to bring to the ark? You think you know, and then you read it and you go, darn it. Okay. So there's a distinction early on between clean and unclean, which probably came from health concerns as much as anything else. But probably that's a little alien to what's happening in this story. We're not there yet in the story. Yeah. Wait,
Just,
yes,
you know,
ma'am.
the Persian Empire, I've forgotten, the dates of that. How, what
Yeah.
influences it playing?
Yeah, so when the people of Israel were taken away, and Laura, you haven't been here enough to hear me say this. I'm the worst historian ever created. Okay.
I don't agree with you.
But when the people of Israel were taken, the ones that were taken away in exile were taken away by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. They were freed when the Persian Empire defeated the Babylonians. It was Cyrus. The book of Isaiah refers to Cyrus as the Messiah because he liberated his people. Cyrus, who was Persian, part of the other empire whose name is running out of my Assyrian Empire. They're the ones who defeated Babylon and ultimately freed the Jews to go back home. Some of them did, many of them did, not all of them did. Some of them were doing pretty well up there. But so yeah, there is influence and happy influence of the Persian around the time that we think the story might have been written. So you might, if the Persians kind of had a lot of sophisticated mathematics and so forth like that, that could be very influential. I don't want to read too much into it because I don't know. But I do think at least at this moment in history, the Persian influence was probably largely welcome because Cyrus was seen not by everybody. He defeated a lot of people, but by some people as being a really just and good ruler. And he was a Persian. And Isaiah certainly saw him as God's instrument, a blessed instrument. So you had a question, I think, a moment ago.
Oh, I was just trying to say that I'd always been taught or learned or read that there were two oral traditions and that's what came together in this chapter. And that's why they're so different and yet sort of the same.
Right. Yeah, and so we'll look at that next week even more so. I agree that there are two oral traditions. And I think one of them ends at chapter 2, verse 4a, and the other one starts in verse 4b. I mentioned the documentary hypothesis. I really wasn't sure if I should have done that. It's the way nerds think about the Old Testament, and especially the first 5 or 6 books of the Old Testament. And it does seem that the hand or the community that eventually wrote this first story is different from the community that wrote the second one. So we're going to be looking next week. We're going to do 2 things. We're going to look for differences between the second creation story and what we had just heard. And we're going to try to treat that story in its own right, not just make it different from the first. Because in fact, I think the story in chapter 2 is probably older as a literary story.
Now, why wouldn't they clean it up and just put one story?
Yeah, you know what? The Bible doesn't do that. And I think we're glad. The same reason the early church didn't just give us one super gospel and clean up all those stories, right? You got a story of a blind man in Mark and 2 blind men in Matthew. You got John that's off the rails telling his story his own way. You got birth story in Luke, you got a different birth story in Matthew. And the early church was comfortable with a plurality of witnesses. There's not just one way to tell a true story. Mm-hmm. And I wish we had trust in that. But that's what the early church gave us. They saw the differences too. And the people of Israel, somebody edited all of these stories together. They saw the differences too. But they, instead of cleaning it all up, They just sewed it all together in some respect. And we're comfortable with that. Right? So our job as readers is to try to find a way of being comfortable with that. Because we've all been taught it's all got to say the same thing or it's not trustworthy. You got to read the Bible the way it was written. That's my new motto. Okay, we have completely run out of time and run on to think, Laurie, it is so good to see you. Yeah, we know. I hope you're healing well. Are you being